I'm 75 years old, and I'm going to tell you something that took me 7 decades to finally understand. Something nobody warned me about, and something most people will never admit out loud. The moment you stop needing people to be happy is the moment your life truly begins. Now let me tell you something that took me a very long time to see clearly, and I mean truly see. Not just understand in my head, but feel it in my bones the way only age can teach you. Most of the friendships you've built in your life, and I say this with love, not to wound you, were never really about you. They were about circumstance. They were about where you happened to be standing when life brought two people close enough to call each other friends. Think about it honestly. Where did most of your friendships begin? At work, in the break room, at the same desk row, in meetings you both didn't want to attend. Or maybe it was the neighborhood. You lived close. Your children played together, so you called each other up on weekends. Or perhaps it was your role in life. The parent at school pickup, the colleague everyone relied on, the neighbor who always waved first. The point is the same. Those connections didn't grow from who you are. They grew from where you were. And for years, maybe decades, that felt like enough. It felt like friendship. You shared meals, you shared jokes, you showed up for each other. And in those moments, it was real. I'm not saying it wasn't. What I am saying is that the glue holding it all together wasn't love or deep understanding. It was shared routine, shared location, shared convenience. Then retirement comes, the routine disappears. The office empties out of your life. The children grow up and scatter. The roles you carried for so long are quietly set down. And what happens to those friendships? They fade, not dramatically. There's no argument, no falling out. They just quietly drift away, like smoke when the fire dies. And you're left standing there wondering what happened. Wondering if you did something wrong. Wondering if you matter less now. I wondered all of that. I sat with that silence and I blamed myself for it. But here is what I eventually understood, sitting on my porch one still morning with nowhere to be and no one calling. Convenience was never a foundation. It was a scaffold. And scaffolding, no matter how solid it looks, always comes down when the building is complete. The friendships that stayed, the ones that didn't need the scaffold, those are the ones worth every minute you give them. Not because you chase them, but because they never needed the routine to survive in the first place. When retirement strips everything away, what remains is not emptiness. It is the truth. And the truth is always kinder than the illusion ever was. Evergreen wisdom. Now here is the second thing I want you to sit with. And this one took me longer to accept than almost anything else in my life. For most of my years, I was afraid of silence. Not the kind of silence that falls between two comfortable people who have nothing left to prove to each other. I mean the deeper silence. The silence of an empty afternoon. The silence of a Sunday with no plans, no calls, no one coming over. That kind of silence used to feel like an accusation, like life pointing a finger at me and saying, "You are alone, and that means something is wrong with you." So I ran from it. I filled my days the way a man fills a leaking boat, frantically, desperately, always reaching for the next distraction before the last one had even settled. A phone call here, an errand that didn't need running, a visit to someone I didn't particularly need to see. I kept myself busy not because I was living fully, but because I was afraid of what I might hear if I ever stopped moving long enough to listen. And do you know what I found in that silence? Not emptiness, not loneliness. Something I hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. I found myself, the version of me that existed before all the noise, before the roles and the obligations and the performing. The quiet, unhurried self that had been waiting patiently, the way a river waits beneath the ice all winter, knowing its time will come. That is when I understood. Solitude is not what happens when life abandons you. Solitude is what life offers you when you are finally ready to stop running. It is not a punishment. It is not a sign that you have failed at friendship or connection or belonging. It is an invitation, the most honest invitation life ever extends, to sit down with yourself and finally get acquainted. Most people never accept that invitation. They spend their whole lives filling the silence, mistaking noise for aliveness and company for peace, and they reach the end of their days still strangers to themselves. There is a third thing I want you to understand, and I want you to hear it not as advice from someone telling you how to live, but as a confession from someone who learned it far too late and paid a quiet, invisible price for not knowing it sooner. When I was working, I never thought about my energy. Not once. It was just there, like water from a tap. You turn the handle, it flows, you never stop to ask how much is left. I gave it freely, to my job, to my colleagues, to obligations I had agreed to years before I understood what agreeing truly cost me. To social events I attended not because I wanted to be there, but because I did not know how to say no without feeling like I had done something wrong. I gave, and I gave, and I called it being a good person. I called it community. I called it loyalty. And maybe some of it was, but a great deal of it, if I am being completely honest with you now, the way only a 75-year-old man with nothing left to prove can be honest, a great deal of it was simply fear. Fear of disappointing people. Fear of being seen as difficult. Fear that if I stopped giving, people would stop coming. And so I kept the tap running long after I should have noticed the pressure dropping. Retirement changes that. Not all at once. Slowly, the way light shifts in a room as the afternoon wears on. You begin to notice things you never had time to notice before. You notice that certain conversations leave you heavy when they should leave you light. You notice that certain people take your afternoon and give you nothing back in return. Not warmth, not laughter, not even the simple comfort of feeling understood. You notice that you have been saying yes for so long that you have forgotten what you actually want to say. And then comes the reckoning. The quiet, uncomfortable moment when you look at your days and realize that your energy, what remains of it, what this season of life still generously offers you, is not a tap anymore. It is more like a candle. Steady and warm, yes. Still capable of lighting a room, absolutely. But finite. Precious in the way that only finite things can ever truly be precious. And a candle that burns for everyone who wanders past it eventually has nothing left to give even to itself. So I became careful. Not cold, not selfish. Careful. The way a man is careful with something irreplaceable. I began to ask before I gave my time, before I gave my presence, before I gave that quiet piece of myself that no one sees but everyone takes. Does this person deserve what I am about to give them? Not deserve it in some grand moral judgment, but deserve it the way a good meal deserves a good table. Does this moment, does this person, does this conversation honor what I am bringing to it? Sometimes the answer was yes. And those moments became richer than anything I had experienced in my busiest, most crowded years. Because presence given freely, from a full and willing heart, is a completely different thing from presence given out of habit and obligation. Now I want to talk about something that stung me more than I expected. Something I did not see coming, even though looking back now, I wonder how I ever missed it. When I was still working, I was somebody. And I say that not with pride, I say it plainly, the way you state a fact about the weather. I had a title. I had a position. I sat at certain tables and people listened when I spoke. My phone rang because people needed my judgment, my signature, my connection to something or someone they wanted access to. Invitations arrived regularly. My opinion was sought on matters large and small. And all of it, all of that warmth and attention and easy belonging, felt like friendship. It felt like proof that I was valued, that I mattered, that the relationships I had built over decades were real and solid and mine. Then I retired, and the phone got quieter, not silent, but quieter. The invitations thinned. The calls that used to come on a Tuesday for no particular reason simply stopped coming. People I had eaten lunch with for 15 years, people whose children's names I knew, people who had sat across from me through 1,000 ordinary conversations, they drifted, politely, painlessly, from their side at least. They just moved on to the next person sitting in the chair I used to occupy. At first, I took it personally. Of course I did. You would too. There is something deeply unsettling about discovering that the warmth you mistook for affection was actually proximity, that the loyalty you believed in was actually convenience in a good suit. I sat with that for a long time, turned it over, looked at it from every angle, the way you examine something you found on the ground, trying to determine whether it is worth keeping or whether you should just set it back down and walk on. And eventually, not quickly, but eventually, I set it down. Because what I came to understand was this: those people were not dishonest. They were not cruel or calculating. They simply related to me the way most people relate to most people, through the role, not through the person. They liked the version of me that came with a desk and a function and a clear reason to be in the room. When the desk disappeared, so did their interest. And that is not a betrayal. That is just human nature, honestly examined. What freed me was realizing that I had done the same to others without ever knowing it. We all do. We attach to people's usefulness and call it connection. We confuse familiarity with intimacy. We mistake a shared building for a shared life. And retirement, more than any other moment I have lived through, holds that truth directly in front of your face and asks you, very quietly, what you plan to do with it. What I did with it was let go. Let go of the sting, let go of the expectation, and let go of the version of myself that needed a title to feel worthy of someone's time. And now we come to the one that I suspect will make some of you uncomfortable, because it made me uncomfortable for the better part of my life. In fact, I would go as far as saying that learning this single thing, truly learning it, not just knowing it in theory but practicing it without guilt, changed the texture of my days more than almost anything else I have done in my 75 years. I am talking about the word no. That small, clean, complete word that most of us were quietly taught to be ashamed of from the time we were old enough to understand what disappointing someone felt like. No. 2 letters, 1 syllable. And yet for decades, that word sat in my throat like a stone I could never quite bring myself to spit out. Instead, I said yes. Yes to the gathering I had no interest in attending, where I would sit for 3 hours making conversation that fed nobody and cost me the following day to recover from. Yes to the favor that was asked of me, not because the person genuinely needed my help, but because they had simply learned that asking me was easier than figuring it out themselves. Yes to the relative who called only when something was wanted, whose voice on the telephone made my shoulders tighten before they had even finished saying hello. I said yes to all of it, and I smiled while I said it, and I told myself this was what good people do. But here is what no one tells you about a yes that comes from obligation rather than desire. It does not land as generosity, not really. It lands in your body as a small, quiet resentment that accumulates the way dust accumulates, invisibly, gradually, until one day you look around and wonder how everything got so heavy. I carried years of those yeses, years of afternoons I gave away that I will never see again. Years of energy spent in rooms I never wanted to be in, with people who never once stopped to ask whether I actually wanted to be there. Retirement strips away the excuses. When you are working, you can always blame the schedule. Too busy, too tired. Another time, perhaps. But when the schedule disappears and the days open up wide and unhurried, the truth becomes harder to hide. You have time. And so every yes becomes a genuine choice, which means every yes that isn't honest is a lie. A small lie, perhaps, but a lie to yourself, which is the worst kind there is. So I learned, slowly, imperfectly, with a good deal of stumbling along the way, to pause before I answered. Just a breath. Just enough space to ask myself honestly, do I want to do this? Or do I simply feel that I should? And when the answer was the latter, I let the no come. Not harshly, not with a door slammed or a lecture delivered. Just quietly, clearly, with the calm dignity of a man who has finally understood that his remaining time is not a public resource available to whoever asks for it first. And something remarkable happened when I started doing that. The people who truly cared for me understood. They did not love me less. If anything, the yes I gave them afterward meant something it had never quite meant before, because they knew and I knew that it was real. And so we arrive at the last thing, the one that quietly holds everything else together. The one that, if you truly absorb it, not just nod at it politely but let it settle all the way down into the place where you actually live, will change not just how you spend your days, but how you feel inside them. Being alone and being lonely are not the same thing. I know that sounds simple. I know you have probably heard some version of it before, but hear me say it the way I mean it, not as a clever phrase to remember, but as something I discovered the hard way, through years of confusing one for the other and paying the price for that confusion in ways I did not fully recognize until much later. For most of my life I believed, without ever examining the belief, that the opposite of lonely was surrounded. That if enough people were present, at the table, in the room, on the end of the telephone, then I was safe from that hollow, drifting feeling that I feared more than almost anything else. And so I kept people close the way some men keep lights on in empty rooms, not because they needed the light, but because the dark made them uneasy. What I did not understand then, what took me far too long to see, is that you can be lonely in a room full of people. Deeply, achingly lonely, in a way that is somehow worse than being alone, because at least when you are alone, the loneliness is honest. It sits with you plainly and makes no pretense about what it is. But loneliness inside a crowd wears a mask. It smiles and passes the bread and asks about your grandchildren, and all the while something inside you is quietly starving for a connection that the noise in the room will never provide. I have sat at tables like that, many times. Tables crowded with voices and laughter and the comfortable business of people performing togetherness at each other. And I have felt beneath all of it, utterly unreached, utterly unseen, present in body and completely absent in every way that actually mattered. That is loneliness, not an empty chair, not a quiet evening, not a Saturday with nowhere to be. Those things are simply solitude, and solitude, as I told you earlier, is something else entirely. Solitude is what happens when you are alone and at peace with it. When the quiet does not feel like an absence but like a space, a generous, unhurried space in which you can simply exist without performing, without explaining yourself, without bending the shape of who you are to fit what the room expects of you. Solitude is the company of your own mind when your own mind has finally become somewhere you are willing to spend time, and reaching that point, making peace with yourself thoroughly enough that your own company becomes genuinely sufficient. That is not a small thing. That is, I would argue, one of the great achievements available to a human being in this life. It does not mean you close the door on everyone. It does not mean you stop loving people or stop welcoming them when they come. What it means is that you no longer need them to arrive in order to feel whole. And that shift, from needing to welcoming, from depending to choosing, transforms every relationship you have left into something cleaner and truer than anything you managed when you were still running from the silence. I've lived 75 years on this earth. I've lost people. I've let go of people. And I've had to rediscover myself more than once. And if I could go back and whisper one thing to my younger self, it would be this: stop chasing a crowded life and start building a full one. Full of meaning, full of stillness, full of mornings where you wake up and the first thought isn't about what anyone else needs, but about what this day means to you. Peace was never out there, waiting in someone else's company. It was always here. It was always you. And the day you truly believe that is the day you finally start living. My channel name is Evergreen Wisdom. Also subscribe. My channel is mentioned.